Right, okay, episode 138, and that's not here, so I'm doing it myself, which means when we get to the metalwork, I'll probably have like 5 seconds to say on each car. So I thought I'd try and counter that by doing some in here. But also, we very rarely show in here. So this is our design studio, I suppose you could call it. You've got Tarks over here, George, Alex is just behind the camera over there, and actually joining us in, I think the 5th of June he starts, will be Luke, who will be down here, and then Nat would normally be sitting at the desk here. But it was also a good week to cover in here, because I'd noticed yesterday there was just an insane amount of finishing off design parts and getting them moved over to being machined. So you were working on the Martin Escort, so this is Project 1 Ankuma, bonnet latch assembly, the safety latch for the bonnet assembly,
hinges.
Yes, bonnet hinges. There's some prototypes down here. So we're doing like a billet bonnet hinge with a gasket on it. You're also doing the centre caps for the Morris Minor. Yes, nicely modelled right here. We've had to do a revision on the, you got the original seatbelt guide for the Morris. Now actually this was entirely my fault, because I described these from a purely visual point of view of saying yes, it should look like this, and then actually we realised when it's in the car the seatbelt kind of goes into this V and goes quite tight when you try and pull it on. So we're doing a revised version of that at the moment. Tarks is working on the console for Churchill, which is kind of a multi-component design. It's all the mounting points for it, the fascia panel, all the billet parts which will mount the switches, the aircon controls, the bezel around the shifter, and then we'll be designing in the side panels and how they mount, and it's all based around a 3D scan, which was the starting point really, wasn't it? So 3D scan of the tunnel, 3D scan of the lower dash, and then actually another bit we're moving on to on that shortly is doing some sort of design visualizations for how the door cards are going to look, and also how we're going to be finishing the ends of the dash, because Stu's kind of done the main fabrication, but we're going to do 3D printed end pieces which will be upholstered on there. So kind of doing some visualizations to see how all that lot's going to tie together and try and make a pleasing end result. I'm trying to think, there was some more billet parts we've been working on. The door handles for the Escorts were kind of approaching being sent off for machining. Brake bells for the Chevette, which was just a sideline job for the grey Rally Chevette. So yeah, there's basically a hell of a lot going on, and it kind of revolves around, this is actually something we've not talked about before, and I might do an episode about this, but the project management side of things. We use an app called Basecamp, which is a fairly generic project management app, but for all of this design stuff we use a job card system on there. So there's kind of everything we know needs to be designed gets thrown into a sort of holding area, and then we kind of pull down into a what's the next job section, and then we can move between the cards. So there's like in progress in terms of design, ready for prototyping, ready for review after the prototype, and then once we're happy with all of that, there's a ready for quote, and that usually then gets sent over to Andy, who does a good amount of our machining, Concept 303, or Darren at Alitech, who does, I would think it's fair to say, the more complicated stuff, essentially the 5-axis stuff. Or some of the parts might be sent out for 3D print if our 3D printer it's not necessarily up to the job surface finish wise of finished parts, so we might get those bits sent out for a 3D print in a more expensive machine that we can't afford, or there might be parts that are just 2D parts getting water jet cut, laser cut, if we want something that's a bit of a nicer finish than we get from our plasma. So yes, it is a hive of activity. And hence why there is an increasing number of people in this area. You come downstairs, follow me, we'll go past Alex, who's been working on essentially the planning for the Escort wiring harnesses. I think at the moment he's just in the process of listing and creating standardised data sheets for all of the components, which is something we're keen to do, although it's not technically necessary for doing a one-off wiring harness to go to that level. It's just very nice to, whenever you're researching information about components, it's nice to have a good record of that, so you build up a database of all of this, so when you're next doing something similar using the same components, you haven't got to research all the same information, you've kind of got it in a record there. Right, follow me through and we'll attempt to cover what's going on in the metal workshop. I'm gonna start right down the other end. And I'll just call a brief halt on the hammering. So Tom and Sam are both on this at the minute. Tom, I think, was just finishing the last rear arch last week. Sam's been working on the inner arch tubs. I can see there's one under there, and he's just conveniently holding the other one over there. So he's just finishing off the second arch tub. And then Tom's moved on to the front end, which has been getting all the front end panel work back on and aligned, and making sure we're happy with all of the alignment between the doors, wings, bonnet, etc. before he then starts cutting out the original bubble arch on those wings and grafting in the new revised arch that we've made. Now that whole front panel alignment was an area that gave us a lot of headaches on the first Escort. This one seems to be going a little bit more smoothly, I'm relieved to say. So although it's always a problem area because the quality of the pressings on the wings is pretty diabolical, and the front panel as well, so you end up with bits that just don't mash up. There's a classic area which, if you look at on other Escorts, you'll see it's always wrong, is the join where the sort of area under the headlight on the wing meets the area under the headlight on the front panel, and the two pressings are just completely different profiles by like several millimeters. So that's always an area that needs a fair amount of tweaking, but it's looking pretty good. So he's happy with the alignment of everything now. We revisited the door hinges on the offside door. I think we'd really already altered them on the near side, but we realised we needed to alter the door hinges on the offside to get the door alignment in the body a little bit better, which is just actually errors in the original manufacture, because the door and the rest of the body side is still original as it came from Ford. But we've done a tweak on that, and then that's allowed us to get everything lined up and crack on with that. Churchill. Scoot round this way. So yeah, Stu's been cracking on with the front end cross member mounting. Done the fabrication on the new mountings that will mount the cross member to the chassis legs at the back. I think last week we saw him doing the reinforcement plates that also form the front mount. Rears are now in, and then they tie in, which is why we decided to revise the engine mounts. We can tie in the gussetry, if that's a word. It's a great word if it's not. Gussetry between the engine mount plinth and the new rear crossmember plinth, so they're both braced as one onto the chassis leg. And then he's just been doing the capping pieces on the end of the sort of reinforcer that comes down the inner wing, which effectively is the triangulation up to the bulkhead onto the chassis leg. And he's got the steering rack in there. He's just been, the UJs for that arrived a couple of days ago, so he's just been gearing up to getting a downlink in there. He's done the hole in the bulkhead for where the downlink goes. So we're really gearing up to get it off the jig and rolling, and we wanted it to be steering, so he's going to finish that downlink tomorrow, put some temporary strut bars in to hold it at ride height all round, or our intended ride height, and then we'll be ready to get this off, put it on the floor. I think we'll probably move the jig out of the way for the minute and start going through some of the jobs that we can do with it sat on the deck. But I just can't wait now we're at this stage to see the shape of the car at ride height, as it will be when it's a finished car. So very, very excited to see that take place, which we should see next week. Moving on, we obviously had a lot of questions about this over the past few months, where the Roadster E-Type had disappeared to, and I think I explained before, it had been away having the revised bonnet shape moulded so we can do a carbon bonnet. And yeah, the intention was that it was going to be back in the mix. The intention actually was that it was going to take over from Churchill. As we got that off the jig, that would then go onto the lift where Kuma's going to be moving from shortly, and this would take the place of Churchill. As it is, unfortunately, we're going to have to take a break on the Project E-Type, the 6-cylinder E-Type, and the Jensen CV8. They're both being built for the same guy, and he rang me yesterday explaining he's got a bit of a financial pickle going on at work. So whilst he sort of rides out and resolves that, he's asked for a break on those projects. Now, as it stands now, I don't know when we're going to be back on with them. It's just one of those things. People's situations change. We're kind of disappointed because we were really in our element with both projects. But yeah, these things happen, and it's a good illustration of why it's great to have a big mix of work around you, because actually for us, with our payments being staged sort of more or less monthly as we go through, there's not really any risk to us. We'll just put these projects to one side until such point as we can carry on. And then we will, but consequently, the progress on this will probably be fast forward somewhat, because we're going to have a sort of free up of labour that would have been working on the CV8. So we'll be able to crack on with this, so very excited to do that. The owner of this, I think, will be coming over next week to have a bit of a meeting about the next stages of work, particularly around the rear end shaping and the construction methods we're going to use. What we want to try and do is have a soft top that hides away completely, so we're just going to have a discussion over how we can achieve that, what the compromises will be elsewhere, etc. So yeah, very excited to be back on with that. Moving on from one extreme to the other, E-Type to Austin Allegro. Scott's been on with the fabrication work on this, essentially carrying on the creation of one body shell from two. I think we probably saw the early stages of what he's on with at the minute last week, is this general A-pillar area. At the minute, he's making a lot of parts, but not welding them on totally, because at the moment we're keeping it still that we can unbolt and take the two shells apart. There's just a few more little jobs we want to do with the body off. And then we'll probably have it on for the final time, and then we'll start welding everything in place properly. But he's generally been working on this area here. There's like an inner skin that goes all the way forward here, which is just a flat panel. A little sort of top hat section, as I'd call it, rib that runs forward here to sort of add the strength from this area straight through into the pillar here. And then an outer panel. He's made quite a nice little press tool. I think that's probably explained the process of that before. We just draw up the shape. Plasma out a negative and a positive, and conveniently he's got an example of the finished results, but we cut out a negative and positive, and I think you just use the fly press for pressing these, yeah, and just glue the pieces together in the right pattern on the fly press. It enables us to press out shapes like that, which add a bit more stiffness to the panel, but also make it look more of a factory item, if you like. So that will eventually go on there. This here is marking out where that reinforcer section will sit underneath, so there'll be holes punched along here to plug weld through to that, because we can't get a spot weld around that. And then the hole here is for this section, which is fabricated, which is where the water drain from the scuttle comes out the side and drains out into the inner wing area. So we're still using the lower tray from the Integra with the upper scuttle from the Allegro, and we'll be panelling in the front and rear there, but that will still act. You'll still have the air intake for the heater here. Rainwater can get in there as it would originally, and then it collects in here and drains out as it would have done in the Integra. So the only real change to this scuttle area, or the drain area, is adding these extensions to bring that through the revised panel here. So yeah, it's taking shape pretty nicely. We've probably said it several times now, but I can never believe how good a sort of fit everything is. And the shapes that you're left to create are actually relatively straightforward shapes, certainly at the moment, and there's going to be some more complicated ones up here, but it's about as good a sort of combination as you could hope for. Body shop, the paint's now been settling for the last week on project one, so the Gaz and Steve have now got that in there, start doing the wet flatting and polishing of that. That'll probably be on for a week, and then that will come through into the assembly shop again. And at the moment, the Stratos is in the paint booth. Last week, the guys were painting the central body tub on it. With the front and rear ended up repainted because we did some modifications on those, and actually, given the opportunity, I wanted to repaint the central tub because there was a few little areas of damage on it. It had a couple of stone chips from when we were testing it, despite us having some protection on there, and there was a little chip in one of the door shuts where the door hadn't been shutting quite right at one point, and nobody had noticed. So we've gone through and repainted that body tub, and then it's actually in there now, so we can have some PPF applied to the lower, basically up to the swage line, all the way down the body, so we don't get any repeat stone chips, particularly where the sort of flanks swage out in front of the rear wheel arch. Okay, so that's what's going on there. Just have a little swig of me Retropower coffee. Everybody will now mass exodus back through there. Nobody knows where to go. Go on, come on, guys. So yeah, CV8 is back in here. Bobby has been on with this. Obviously, I'm a little bit disappointed he's going to have to stop for a while on it now, but he's been working on the boot area. He was doing all the reinforcement structure for inside the boot lid. got that to a stage where he was happy to hand that over to the body guys to sort of start fiberglassing that in and creating the final buck for the carbon boot lid. And then he was just moving towards the latch for that and had identified a Fiat 500 latch and striker. The latch is really compact and has got an integral solenoid and pin switch in it. And it looked like we could actually mount that the original way. So originally on this boot lid, the latch is at the top because the button's on the boot lid and the striker's on the bottom, which is quite unusual for it to be that way around. So we were trying to work out whether we could still do it that way, because there's not a lot of room on the boot lid to fit a bulkier latch mechanism in with central locking. But actually the Fiat 500 one looked very promising, so that's kind of was going to be his next step. And then he was been working on the fuel tank arrangement, designing the fuel tank, which I think he's been doing on CAD. But there was some checks we wanted to do. There's a classic mistake you can make when designing something like a fuel tank, is you can get it designed that it fits perfectly in the space, but then find that it doesn't fit into the space through the aperture it's got to pass through. And it's actually something we've been considering for the headlining, because we're doing a sort of single piece, or the plan was single piece fiberglass headlining, but we were musing the other day over whether we'd be able to get that in. So it may well be that we do the same idea, a hard fiberglass headlining that's upholstered, but potentially do it in two pieces. But yeah, similar with the fuel tank, making sure we can actually get the tank into the space. So he was creating some cardboard profiles of, like, imagine like a sideways cross section through the tank, to make sure that could actually pass down through the available space and into place. Also, he's done the well in the boot floor under the fuel tank for where there'll be a dropped section a dropped pot, if you like, in the tank, which is where the in-tank pump's going to sit to make sure that the fuel can't surge away from the pickup on that. So yeah, it was all fuel tank related stuff, and then the revised boot hinge methods that we talked about last week. So that's that. Unfortunately paused now. Let's have a little move around here. Adam's been on, if you come around here actually, Adam's been on with the Land Cruiser again. He's done the side step fitment. The other Adam's been on with the dash. He's been sorting out the light that sits in the bottom of the dash, which illuminates the switchgear on the dash. If you cast your mind back, as we like to say, to when we did the switchgear, it's all our own switchgear with our own machine billet knobs on there, but they're not self-illuminating. Now on the original Land Cruiser dash there is a downlighter on the bottom of it which does the same job, because the original switchgear is not illuminated either. But we'd noticed it was over to one side, and we weren't keen on the fact that with everything looking so symmetrical, that would cast a really weird uneven shadow on the dash. So before the dash was upholstered, we revised that, made provision centrally for that light, and made provision for our own sort of lens to sit over the top of it, like a smoked acrylic lens. So when you look under the dash when it's not on, it's not very obvious that there's a light there at all. But when you turn the headlights on, it casts light down over those switches, and because it's central, all the shadows look symmetrical. So that's good, pleasing. I think he was just getting to the point of needing to fit the dash demist vent pieces, which we've realised are no longer available. So we're going to use the originals, but do a black plastic paint on those, which I'm never hugely keen on using, but I have been quite surprised with how well it adheres. You always sort of psychologically think it's not going to stick, but I've been surprised in the past. And then what else have we been on with on this? I think at the moment he's just working on the seals on the doors. We've adjusted the front door alignment now, so we're happy with how those seal. The rear door seals have never been, they're a reproduction seal, and I'm not really happy with, because you can see some of it around the door and it looks uneven. So we're going to take those seals off, and we're going to trial our own just generic profile of rubber seal around the door to see if we can get better results than the moulded ones, which aren't very well made. So that's that, and then I've just had the engine fired up on this, running really great. The only thing we've been chasing on that is there's a small squeak, and we've been trying to work out what that might be. And I think it's either a cam belt tensioner or possibly the water pump pulley. So tomorrow I think we're going to pull the lower cam belt housing covers off and just see if we can get in with a stethoscope there to listen a bit more clearly. We've been listening all over it with a stethoscope, and it definitely sounds like it's cam belt train related. It's definitely at the front somewhere, so we're going to have a further investigate on that. George has been on with the grill on this as well. I think we saw him plasmering the frame for that last week. The mesh is now attached to that. The guys have painted it, so that's ready to go. We're just waiting for the clips that attach it to be back from Xylan coating. But yeah, I'm kind of excited to see that on, because then we'll have the Toyota badge in the middle of that, which has never been on yet. We'll put the grille surround back on, and that'll be the finished appearance of the front end then. Oh, and Tarks was on with another little job on this, of just making a little nylon bezel around where the bonnet prop goes, because we had a rubber grommet in there, and the tendency is when you pull the bonnet prop out, it tends to pull the grommet with it. So we've decided to make a nylon bezel that clicks into place in there. So yeah, I think that is where we're at on that. I feel like there was probably something else. Oh, we had the seat frames are assembled. I think they were last week actually. Yeah, I think I'm covering a job we've already covered there. Right, have a wander over here. You have to excuse me if I'm getting a bit vague and off piste in some places, because it's always difficult doing the entire tour by yourself because there's so much to remember. So Morris, good news and bad. The good news is the power steering fault is definitely gone now. So I've been out testing this the last couple of days. Never had any return of that sticking pressure relief valve. Also, we've resolved the fact that there was some fluid coming out of the vent on the cap. We've made a little fabricated shield that sits on the bottom of the cap. The caps are our own design, and they had a little female thread in them, and they have a little filter that threads in the inside, a little sintered filter. So we've actually used the same thread to make a little machined shield that guides where the oil was sheeting across the bottom of the cap and being thrown out through the breather. It kind of just sheets around the sides of this little shield now, and that works really well. Didn't get any fluid out of that on test. The downside is I still do have the clutch slip problem, and I'm starting to think it is actually the clutch slipping. It doesn't seem to be hydraulic actuation. Well, I took it out again, same symptoms, wasn't there when it was cold, did start to slip after I'd driven it for a few miles. But we brought it in here and put it straight over the pit immediately when it had been slipping. And I figure if it was a hydraulic actuation issue, there would still be pressure. The clutch would be being held on by a body of fluid in the slave cylinder, and therefore if you crack the bleed nipple loose, there should be a load of pressure in there as the clutch is released. And we tried that and there wasn't, and immediately after cracking the bleed nipple, not finding that there was loads of pressure in the slave, and doing it back up, we took it straight back out and it was immediately slipping, which I think is fairly conclusive on it not being hydraulically held, partially disengaged. So we're getting to the point where I can't think of anything else other than it's just that when it gets hot after a few uses, it starts to slip because maybe the clamping force isn't enough. So we're just I think we're at the point now we're going to have to drop the gearbox out of it and investigate that. And I've kind of got this sort of feeling of dread that I don't want to do all of that work and then just go, yes, everything looks absolutely fine. But I've kind of got to the point I don't think that it can be anything else now. So that's the next step. James is working through a few other jobs on this. We've still got to do a micro switch on the handbrake for the warning light, a bezel for the handbrake gaiter, and a few other small jobs inside. So he's kind of working through those at the minute. I can also see conveniently looking through there that George's 3D print prototype of the revised seatbelt guide is in as well. So that's looking good. Just skipping back momentarily to the Camaro, Anthony. Who was this his first week? I think it is, isn't it? Yeah, so Anthony's first week. He's been on with the radiator work that John started previously, getting those caps marked out and perfectly aligned with the holes in the slam panel. They're now ready for welding. He's also done the fan brackets. In fact, they're just tacked on at the minute because he's just had everything in, checking the fan position, checking the clearance of everything, making sure it's actually possible to fit and remove the radiator with those brackets on, making sure we've not overlooked anything essentially. So now we're happy that that's good, that can be fully welded, the caps can be welded on, all that lot can go in, and we can get everything else in place then on that once that's been painted. And then he's also been on with the Mustang, which conveniently is the next one in the row. So there was one final job. I'd mentioned previously, I think, that we were not particularly hurrying on this because the owners had been having a garage built, and so we didn't have anywhere to put it. But there was one remaining job. When I was previously taking it out, everything was good. but I wasn't totally happy with the brake feel. It seemed like the servo feeling was slightly odd, like it felt like there was a reasonable amount of assistance on the light braking, but when you went for more, there wasn't any more assistance there. And so we did some measurements of the vacuum at the servo and concluded there wasn't really enough vacuum at the servo. There was a fair bit, but it wasn't as much as you'd like to see. And I suspect this is because of the engine is running modified cams, and it's a common thing that if you're running different cam profiles, it can reduce the amount of engine vacuum because of the valve overlap. So we have opted to go with an electric vacuum pump on this now from Lead in the States. So Anthony's been installing that, sitting down in the front here. So that just has a vacuum sensor in it. It runs until it's up to vacuum, cuts out, and then as soon as the vacuum drops again, it kicks back in. And that pretty much has sorted that now. I mean, I wouldn't say it's got the world's best brakes, but it certainly is. I'm happy with everything on it now. They're definitely up to the job. There's not an odd feeling about the servo assistance anymore. And we also just tightened up the adjusters on the rear drums because they were a bit slack. It was giving us a bit of a long pedal. So that's all sorted. And I think that pretty much concludes this. So we're going to send this back over to Dale early next week just to give it a final pre-delivery once over and clean it all up, because obviously we've let it get covered in dust and dirt. And then I think the following week it will be going to its new home. So this would hopefully might do one more feature, and then hopefully it will be out of the weekly episodes. E-Type, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be paused on this project. But up until that point, because I was only informed of that yesterday, we've been working on the fuel system. So James has got his fuel system sort of in-tank pump arrangement all sorted. He's got the pipes that lead to that now crimped up. Yeah, essentially buttoned up the fuel system, and then he'd moved on to the dash work that he'd started previously. So he's finalised the locations for the PDM and ECU, made the ECU bracket, made the retaining brackets for the billet piece in the middle that's going to hold the Motec screen, put the holes in the dash fascia for the vents, and that was basically the sequence, was trying to get all of the things that are going to go behind the dash behind there so we could start planning the wiring loom. But as I say, this is on hold at the moment. And I think, I always feel like I've missed something, and if there's not a visual reference, I probably will have done. But I think for the moment, that is where we're at. So have a good weekend, and I shall see you next week. Right.